Hi everyone, it's Professor Fernandez, and here is the second video on how to write about literature, specifically focusing on the body paragraphs. So let's do a little bit of a recap. Last video, I kind of drew an outline for you about what the body paragraphs are going to look like, and then drew out kind of what the entire paper could look like. Of course, you're going to have an introduction, with your thesis, and the thesis is going to include the argument that you think that the story is doing, and then the three things you're looking at that is being used to build the argument. Then you are going to go into your first body paragraph. And so your first body paragraph, your second, and your third are all going to follow the same structure. The only thing that's different is going to be what you're talking about. So since in our thesis we know we're going to list character, setting, and plot in that order, we're going to talk about each one of those things in the paper in that order. You're going to talk about character, you're going to talk about setting in that second body paragraph, and you're going to talk about plot in that third body paragraph. So going through this very quickly, it has the topics in it. You're going to set up an example there. You're going to give a quote or give an example. It doesn't necessarily have to be a quote. It can be a paraphrase. You're going to explain the example, and that's going to take some time here, as you can tell by all the wonderful dots here. And then you're going to wrap everything up with a point sentence, and it just ties everything together, and it concludes the paragraph, and it's usually one sentence. And you'll do this 3 times, of course. And then you'll have a conclusion. And the conclusion, of course, restates the thesis, it highlights what you just said, and it ties everything up in a nice little bow. So your conclusion is definitely more than 2 or 3 paragraphs. It's a pretty substantial paragraph as well. So that's kind of the structure of this paper, and I wanted to do this video so you got to see what it actually looks like. I'm just going to show you 2 body paragraphs. I'm going to read through it for you. And so that way you're able to see what this looks like. This is actually a student's paper, one of my former students' paper. And it's about a story that you haven't read yet, possibly, if you're in my summer 2021 class. We haven't read this. So I have taken out a spoiler that the student has written. So when you see a bunch of X's, it's because the spoiler is there. So I don't want to give anything away. This is an interesting type of story. But I do like how this student talked about things and how they expanded the thought. And so I'm going to read through this, and I'm going to talk about what they did well, why I think it was done well, and point out some things that I think would help you with yours. So getting started, of course, we're going to start with the topic sentence here. And the topic sentence talks a little bit about the argument. And her argument, although it was not as strong as I would like it to be, it was arguable. And this one says her argument was something along the lines of manipulation has many consequences, or has unregrettable consequences, or something like that. And so it was arguable, and it was short, and it had hit all the criteria, so she didn't get a ding for her argument. So she mentions her argument here in the topic sentence, and she talks about what she's going to talk about. Here she's talking about plot. So plot was the first thing in her thesis that she said she was going to talk about. So she talked about plot, and she's talking right here about the structure, specifically the exposition. And if you just saw the plot lesson, we talked about exposition, and what that is in that context. And so she talks about exposition, and she kind of gives me a little bit of a definition here, offering the reader the background, the exposition, right? So whenever you're bringing in any like literary devices or any of these terms that we've learned throughout the semester, you definitely want to define them, right? The whole idea is that what you don't want to think about is that, oh, well, my teacher assigned this and so she knows what exposition is. I learned it from her. I learned it by watching her, right? No, the goal of this isn't about just putting something down on paper just to fulfill a requirement. The goal of this is for you to show me that you've learned some things and that you're applying what you learned to the story, and that you're thinking critically about it. So that's kind of the goal, and that's what's being measured here. So we have the thought of exposition here, and so she says first, this is what this author did to demonstrate the husband's manipulation of Christina. The story's name, by the way, is called The House Made of Sugar. And so if you haven't read it yet, there's nothing, I made sure there were no spoilers here. Okay, so the next sentence. The husband discusses all of Christina's superstitions. He states that Christina believes that the fate of the previous occupants would influence her life. He had no choice but to lie to Christina so that they might find at last a place to live. Okay, so do you see how she is setting up the quote here? She decided to use a quote, and it wasn't the full quote, it was part of the quote, and that's perfectly fine. Usually if you were doing more than one story, you kind of want to do, the in-text citation here. But because there's only one story that the student in particular is focusing on, and there are no other outside sources, it's quite okay to not do the in-text citation. There's only one source. There's no outside sources. It's all critical thinking, so it's perfectly fine, right? But if there's another outside source, say if you were looking at two stories instead of just one, say if you were actually bringing in some research, then you would have in-text citations because you would have a works cited page. All right, so she sets up the quote. And by setting up the quote, I mean she's giving me some context about this quote, what's going on at the time that this quote is happening, and what's kind of the result there. And then she talks about this quote, right? So remember, the second thing after you set up the quote, and it's going to take more than just one sentence, right? I personally I like how she set this up. I think maybe one more sentence to set it up just a tad bit better, but there's nothing wrong with that. Then after you set up the quote, then you're going to explain the quote, okay? Offering the background first sets the structure for the story, helping the reader understand the husband's and Christina's mindset. As the story dives into madness, so does the reader. Each detail is more head-scratching than the last, right? So you're explaining this, and you're really talking about things from the reader's perspective, which is what you want to talk about as well. And then you then you bring it back to the literary device here. By starting with exposition, Ocampo is setting up the reader to be manipulated, just like Christina is being manipulated by her husband in the story. The reader begins to question what is real and what isn't. However, starting with exposition, a clear example of the plot structure, and that should be or Aristotle's Poetics, there is a grounding for the reader, something that they come back to when things are not what they seem. Now here is what elevates this example from a nice solid B to an A, because not only did they mention that they're using exposition, and pretty much all three examples of plot structure uses exposition. She specifically said, I'm using the plot structure, which is also known as Aristotle's Poetics. And the reason that exposition here is so important is that it grounds the reader. She's not only talking about the thing or the technique, but the effect and the impact of the literary device or the technique, or in this case, the part of the plot structure. Why it's important for the reader and the impact that it has. And because it impacts the reader in this way, it allows the writer to argue their argument, right? It's very well done here. The student continues. As the plot continues and approaches the climax, see another part of the plot, right? The plot structure, she called it. The manipulation creates a twist in the story, something that the reader may have seen coming, but didn't believe would happen. This aids the writer in her argument of manipulation causing unexpected consequences. And so she's telling me all of this, all of these things that are happening, how the writer is using these plot devices to help her argue her argument, and then the money sentence. All of this is aiding the writer in arguing this, right? So she's explaining all of this, how it all works, and then she brings it right back to the argument, which is why this is slightly different than a literary analysis, because the literary analysis talks about the literary devices and how they're used. Sometimes it talks about how they're being used, or something in the room, how they're being used to talk about a theme, talk about a motif, blah, blah, blah. This is specifically talking about argument. Okay. It continues. The consequences are not expected, and the reader walks away, much like the husband, in disbelief. As the writer continues to the climax of the story, the twist that was foreshadowed earlier, and this is where I took out the spoiler, comes to be. Although the reader isn't surprised, the building and establishment of the argument makes itself clear. Manipulation, and in this case gaslighting, has consequences that boomerang around and destroy everything, right? And so we have, this is called the point sentence, and what a point sentence does, think of it as a conclusion. It's a conclusionary sentence to the paragraph. So we already established that this unexpected thing was foreshadowed, but you really didn't think it was going to happen. It's not going to be that crazy. It ends up being that crazy. And so then you kind of tie it all together, that this is building this argument, and the consequences boomerang and destroy everything, right? And that ties that up together quite nicely. And that's one paragraph. So then we have the second paragraph here. Ocampo also uses the setting of the story to demonstrate and build her argument. Manipulation causes unexpected consequences. So just like the topic sentence of that first body paragraph, the second body paragraph talks about the thing, right? The literary device or the technique. In this case, we're talking about setting, right? And then the argument, manipulation causes unexpected consequences. Done, right? It tells the reader, which is moi, that I am changing subjects. I'm no longer talking about plot. I am talking about setting, and I'm tying it back to the argument. Okay, so you know what the next thing is, right? You have to set up the quote, and then you got to give the example of the quote. What this student does is that she kind of melds those two steps together. I personally don't like it. However, if it's done well, I can excuse it. And she does this well here. In the story, the husband states, "The visit seemed to me that I had watched a theatrical rehearsal, and the reality of the situation was something else." Now we begin to see the consequences of the husband's deceit, and the house of sugar slowly crumbles. Again, this is well done. She gives me a little bit of context here. And the context really is actually in the quote. So she didn't have to do much heavy lifting. I wish there was one more sentence, like maybe right there, to set up the quote a little bit better. But she does it. Like when I read it, I didn't miss it. So I was happy with it. So then, of course, the next step is that you're beginning to explain the example, the quote or the paraphrase, whatever you choose to use. Now we begin to see the consequences of the deceit. Ocampo also uses symbolism of the sweet treats in the story. So remember, like, we have setting, we're going to use symbolism to talk about this setting and the setup of this argument. Ocampo also uses symbolism of the sweet treats in the story. Symbolism means that an object or person is representative of an idea. So remember I said, if you're going to talk about a literary device or a thing, you want to define it. So she's going to use symbolism. She put the definition of symbolism here, and then she's now going to talk to me about what is being symbolized and what it means. Okay? The house is white and sugar-like, delicate and susceptible to many outward dangers. And in the story it is. Christina stops making her husband conclude that the house of sugar... Oh, it's making... I know what she meant here. Sweets for her husband, and concludes that the house of sugar is disintegrating like the couple's relationship, thus making the house a symbol. So she literally is talking about symbolism here and tying this back. So for example, a lot of you were talking about the flower pot in Popular Mechanics and that being a symbol. And you probably got dinged for it because very, very few people can actually say, a lot of people say it's symbolism, few people can prove that it's symbolism. They usually get it from either a class they were in that talked about it or from online. And just because somebody said it doesn't mean it is. You have to prove that it is. And she proved it here because the house looks like it's made of sugar. Sugar disintegrates when outside things come to it, water, sugar, ants, whatever. And so just like a house that would be made of sugar, outside things are starting to disintegrate this couple's relationship. And thus, the couple's relationship is a symbol. Yeah, the house made of sugar is a symbol for the couple's relationship. You see how she argued that? That's important. So don't just say something is a symbol. Tell me why it's a symbol, how it's representative of the symbol. And it's almost like it's compared, like you're comparing it, but not really. Like, don't compare it. But like, it's almost like you're saying, all right, this is a symbol for this couple's relationship, or this is a symbol for let's say the television in Harrison Bergeron can be a symbol for the detachment of the parents from Harrison. They can see them. They can see him, but he can't see them. And so this is almost like this is similar to a two-way mirror in a police station where you can only see one way, but you can't see out. And the people who can't see in are the people who are being accused. The only people who can see out are the people who are doing the accusation or the interrogation. And so then the television set becomes a symbol of a hostile symbol of interrogation or something like that. You see how that line of thinking kind of proves that? So that's what you want to do here. At the point of the story when Christina stops making her husband's favorite treat, the lack of sweets symbolizes the beginning of Christina's mistrust of her husband and manifests the consequences of her husband's manipulation of his wife. Right? So she continues that. And now she brings it back to the argument. That's the important part. Now, you've talked about the example, you've expanded on the example, you've defined the literary device or the technique, you've talked about it, you've drawn the whole breadcrumbs conclusion of it, and now bring it back to the argument. In this way, Ocampo is expressing her argument of manipulation and the unexpected consequences. By converting a large part of the setting into a symbol for the couple's relationship, Ocampo is commenting on the consequences, the disintegration and destruction of trust, and a young relationship that should have blossomed. Done. You see how that works? Now she could expand here a little bit, but she's kind of mic dropped it right here, so she doesn't really need to expand it. And so that's how these paragraphs work. So let me go back to this wonderful outline here. So you have like the body paragraph. Was there a topic sentence in them? Yes. And they talked about the thing that they were talking about. They set up the example. They gave the example, which could be a quote or paragraph, or paraphrase. For both of these examples, it was a quote, which is perfectly fine. A paraphrase is perfectly fine. It doesn't have to be a quote. I know quotes are great, but sometimes you're like, I could say this a lot better. So say it, right? Quotes are supposed to be special. You're supposed to use it because you can't paraphrase it. This example right here, the way it's worded, the way it was written, shows it, proves what I'm going to say, right? Then you explain the example, and the example has context. It tells you what's going on, how it impacts the story or the characters, blah, 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 what the writer's doing, any literary devices that's being used, and it's doing all this stuff. And this is going to take a while, as you saw. And then the last is the point sentence at the end, right? A mic drop sentence, I should say. And that's it. That's pretty much what you do. You do it over and over and over again. So this in-depthness is what I should see if you're in my summer 2021 class, is what I should see in your story charts. I should see stuff as in-depth as this in your story charts. I should see your work, say like if you have to do another PowerPoint on something, it should be this in depth, because you can use that depth that you use in those exercises to help you with your papers, right? I don't have you do those exercises just because I need you to do a grade. I have you do those exercises so that your papers are a little bit easier. All right, please let me know if there's any questions, and good luck on your paper.